When, can everybody hear me okay? Do I need to use a microphone? I can't tell what the answer is. No need. When Yuri Nikolaevich first asked me to come here, I thought he was joking. I said, what do you need a lawyer for? For what do you need a lawyer? But he insisted, so I came, and I'm glad I did, because I go to these conferences all the time, and I've learned things here I didn't learn in any other conference. I've learned about the African Space Agency. I didn't even know it existed. I've learned about the Eurasian Economic Community. I didn't even know it existed. So that's a very strong recommendation, by the way, for a second-year conference. So even though there's not very many people here, this is going to be an important conference, and I notice you're recording it. I'd like to have a copy of the recording.
Okay. We record all our highlight lectures, so don't worry that we have
don't worry.
many people here, but we recorded, we'll spread it.
Okay, I'm ready to get going. Have you got good enough audio back there? Okay. I have a half an hour. That means I have to give you a course in American law and in commercial space activities and in space economics in a half an hour. So this is going to be really interesting. Law of commercial space activities. I want you to keep two thoughts very firmly in your mind. In a sufficiently advanced technology, you can't tell it from magic. And secondly, magic is just engineering. Is just engineering. These are by science fiction writers. So please keep this in mind. I'm going to tell you some things that will seem impossible. They're not impossible. Next slide. In 1936, very close to this location, Mosfilm made a film about going to the moon. It was a silent film. It's a very good film. I commend it to your attention. But by 2019, we'd gone to the moon. But we weren't living there. We weren't using it for anything. And it's been nearly half a century since we first landed. Why did it take so long? Well, I can tell you the reason, and it's not technology. With this pen, I could write a contract with Roscosmos that would take you to the moon, that would mine asteroids. The same thing with NASA, the same thing with ESA or JAXA or CAST in China. The technology is not the problem. It's law and economics. So what is space law? It is traditional law. You can look down from space. There is no statute or treaty about this. It's just done and accepted. It's called customary space law. International treaties. There are 5 international treaties. They started in 1967. We'll go over them in just a minute. But they are totally out of date, and they are not useful for the future, unfortunately. We have to have new law. We have international agreements. The biggest example is the space station. It is an international agreement between 16 countries. This is not a law, it's not a treaty. It's just an international executive agreement. Then national law, very important. International treaty law does not apply to individuals. It applies to states. And the states then apply the international legal norms and the treaty obligations through national legislation. And that national legislation may be different for every country. And then under those national laws, there will be the actual mechanics of how you do activities in space. And that is called national regulations. For example, if I want to launch from the United States, there is a launch licensing statute. But I must obey the regulations that are promulgated under that statute. They're very detailed, and they give the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States the right to license a launch, license a spaceport, and license a reentry operation. But nothing else. And national policy. This is national security, foreign policy, and other things that cannot be reflected in law but are very powerful in actual practice. Next slide. Well, the United Nations Committee for the Peaceful Use of Outer Space was set up in the 1960s in response to the launch of Sputnik, and the 1967 treaty, called the Outer Space Treaty, was a compromise between the Soviet Union and the United States. The United States was terrified that the Soviet Union would claim the moon. They'd landed on the moon, America couldn't do it. The Soviet Union was very apprehensive about free enterprise getting into space, American business. The Soviet Union was the seashore of space. It was for communism. It wasn't for capitalism. So we came up with this treaty, and it has two major points. One is that there's international responsibility for activities conducted in space by non-governmental entities. It is the only area of law where this is true. If I have a 787 that crashes into the Kremlin, the US government is not liable for that damage. But if a satellite falls onto the Kremlin, the US government is liable. And secondly, the states that are the launching states must assume liability for regulation and supervision and authorization. This is Article 6, and it is a contentious article now because every nation has different rules for how they interpret authorization and continuing supervision. As a result of that, there were 4 more treaties. They all come from paragraphs in that first treaty. And for the last 40 years, there's been no new treaties. The UN stopped being a source of international law in 1979. It is now a discussion forum for what might happen in the future. There are 4 United Nations resolutions that are non-binding. They're just General Assembly resolutions, and they suggest how to handle some parts of space law, but they are not obligatory, and they have not been adopted by countries. They are just guidance. Next slide. Now, the Intergovernmental Agreement on the Space Station is an executive agreement between 14 to 16 countries, and it created this $150 billion outpost that we have up in space. It's a superb example of international cooperation between former enemies, mainly the United States and now Russia as the successor state to the Soviet Union. It does many things. I commend it to your attention. I'm not going to discuss it. It would take too long. There are then multilateral and bilateral agreements on hundreds of different things in space, and they are treaties or executive agreements. Next slide. Now, the United States implements space law in its federal law and in its state law. This is hard to understand if you're from Europe. The United States is a federal republic. There are 51 independent states that came together to become the United States. And we have a written constitution that is the supreme law. But most law is still state law, not federal law. But the federal statutes created NASA, provided for control of communications satellites, provided control of launching of rockets, extended the general jurisdiction of the United States to U.S. registered space objects under the 1976 Registration Convention. Then patent law was specifically extended by 35 United States Code to U.S. registered space objects. And finally, there's law controlling the crew on the space station, and perhaps most importantly, our national security law having to do with export control, which is implemented by the Department of State, and that is very complicated. Then there is state law. I mean states like Texas and Florida, the individual units of the United States. There is no corporation law for America. There are 51 different corporation laws, and they are very different in some cases. There is no law of marriage. There is no law of contract. The contract laws are state laws, generally speaking. And these all apply to activities in space. A good example, damage done on the way up to space is covered by federal law. In space is covered by the law of 10 different states that have authorized their law to go into space to attract spaceports. There are 22 spaceports that have been authorized by the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States. And finally, what about wrongful death of astronauts? There is no federal law on this. It is the state law, in this case of Texas or Florida, when the shuttle blew up or when the shuttle disintegrated coming down. Have I given you the idea that this is a rather complicated mosaic of law? In the first 10 minutes of my talk, I've now covered what I normally cover in a 3-credit-hour course at the University of Houston. Next slide. We have 3 sectors in the American space program. We have the civil space program run by NASA. We have the military space program run by the Central Intelligence Agency, the Department of Defense, and the National Reconnaissance Office. We have the commercial space activities, which are regulated by the Federal Aviation Administration, but that does not control space industry. We are currently in the process of building federal law within the Department of Commerce in the United States to control non-governmental space activities. This is an ongoing political debate in the United States in the current Congress. I expect in the next 2 years we will have firm law, and then we will promulgate regulations on that. Finally, we have the law that was passed in 2015, which codifies the existing law that any American may go into space, may obtain mineral resources, and may own those resources. They're not claiming the moon, they're not claiming an asteroid, but if you go use the resources and take them by mining, in the United States they can be owned. And they can be sold, and you can use them to build a business. And the same thing has happened in Europe and Luxembourg. There is an ongoing debate in the international community about whether or not this is appropriate, but it is certainly legal in the United States and Luxembourg. Next slide. President Trump has told NASA to go back to the moon by 2024. Jeff Bezos then announced that he had built a lander called Blue Moon to do that. I think that this is an interesting policy activity, and it is a public-private partnership, much like SpaceX. Now, a lot of the rest of my talk is going to be about economics. I'll just warn you about that, because you must look at space law within a larger matrix of economic reality and, in the United States, commercial reality, because the state space program is rapidly being eclipsed by commercial interests. Next slide. Well, what is the market? Why are they doing this? This is a Futron study that my corporation paid for about 3 years ago. $1 billion per year in revenue for space tourism. It will be bigger than that, but we can guarantee that much. Suborbital flights is the biggest share. Orbital flights are possible. There's even a possibility of commercially going to the moon. And I'll get to a surprise in a few slides that may amaze you. I hope it will amaze you. Now, this is a current study. It was privately financed through Futron, which is the leading economic company in Washington that does economic analysis. Next slide. President Obama in 2015 codified existing U.S. law. This is nothing new. We're just writing it down so that everybody knows it, to remove doubt, to remove risk, to remove uncertainty. U.S. citizens engaged in commercial exploration and exploitation of space resources, including water, they can do that. It's legal in the United States. It's probably legal everywhere else in the world too, but I can't speak to that. We are not asserting sovereignty or exclusive rights or jurisdiction over any celestial body, just over the minerals that are removed for use. Next slide. Luxembourg followed up with an even broader law that allows any company in Luxembourg to own space resources, to buy them, to sell them. And they then put 200 million euros of direct government investment into space mining. Why did Luxembourg do this? It's very simple. They got in early to the communications satellite industry by chartering SES. They still own 30% of the largest communications satellite company in the world, and it finances a lot of their government. They're trying to do the same thing with space mining. And the Minister of Economics in Luxembourg mentioned that he was taking the sharp risk off, and he expected the wealth managers in Luxembourg to put in another €1 billion of direct investment from their wealth funds. And that is ongoing right now. Next slide. So where are we now? Where are we going? What is our economic and business reality that's behind this law, that's driving the law? Next slide. Well, this is the current, as of 2 years ago, it's as current as I can get, about $350 billion worldwide, and about 35 to 45% of that, depending on how you do the accounting, is government money. The rest is private money. Next slide. In one graph from The Economist, this shows you every space launch since 1957, since October 4th, 1957, all the way up to 2018. And you'll notice at first it was government, and now it's becoming private. This is a trend that will show you the future. The cost of launching into space has dropped. Right now, if you launch on an Atlas, it's $13,000 a kilogram. But if you launch on a Falcon 9, it's $2,700 a kilogram. And the Falcon Heavy is probably considerably below that. You can buy 22 metric tons to orbit for $50 million today. You can buy a full Falcon 9 launch. Next slide. Now I show you the future. This is the only way I know to predict the future with any accuracy at all. This is the number of STEM graduates in the major countries. Look at India. Look at China. In 10 years, the Chinese economy will be bigger than the US economy. Roughly 10 to 15 years after that, the Indian economy will be bigger than the Chinese economy. That's if current trends hold. If we get lucky in the States and we invent wonderful new things that make great new wealth, then maybe the United States economy stays the biggest economy in the world. In the past, that's what's happened with cell phones and the internet, Intel and Microsoft and Google and Apple and so on and so forth. But I tell you, you couldn't build this Apple telephone in the United States. It's built in China. Next slide. Now, how about space budgets? Remember, it's going to be a talk about economics now. The US has a space budget that is considerably larger than any other country and possibly all the other countries put together. Now, this is both the defense and the civil sector and the commercial sector. Next slide. If you just look at the civil sector at NASA, the NASA budget is larger than the other budgets. Eventually, the commercial budget will be much larger than either the defense budget or the NASA budget. And we're beginning to see this exponential curve of rising investments that is going to be the dominant force for the next 10 to 50 years in space. I repeat, it is an exponential growth curve. In economics, it is the beginning of a long-term capital investment cycle. That's important to remember. Next slide. Now, the NASA budget, adjusted to current dollars, has been relatively stable for half a century. For half a century. It's a big investment by a very powerful country, but it will be eclipsed by the commercial investment in space. And that is the challenge for this university. It's the challenge for the students at this university, because they will be the people who invent the new inventions, that go out and build the new companies, that take part in this future. Next slide. Now, NASA budget requests through 2022 are on this chart, just to show you that the funding plan is stable. And as a matter of fact, it is underestimated in this slide, because we've already added several $billion per year for the Trump initiative to go back to the moon by 2024. The NASA budget is about $21 billion a year now. Next slide. Of that, they have invested 5% of their budget, only 5%, in a new way of government contracting. They call it commercial. They call it commercial cargo. They call it commercial crew. It is not commercial. It is just a way to spend government money that is more efficient. The Falcon 9 was built almost entirely on NASA dollars as progress payments on a $1.8 billion fixed price contract with milestones. I've seen the contract, I'm familiar with it. It was not a commercial program. On the other hand, Jeff Bezos, the new Glenn, the new Shepard, the new Armstrong, when it comes along, these are truly commercial projects. They are privately funded. They are not funded by government. And there are 100 companies in the United States and the rest of the world that are building small launch vehicles today, over 100. And these are commercial companies. I'll give you an example from Ukraine. Firefly is a Ukrainian company that has American offices, and it's building a 1 to 5 ton launch vehicle. And it's doing it entirely with private money. The Electron from New Zealand, and there are 100 other examples. Next slide. By the way, that 5% of the NASA budget that was put into the so-called commercial crew and commercial cargo programs built the Falcon 9, the Antares, the Dragon supply capsule, the Dragon manned capsule, and the Cygnus capsule. And there are 6 independent, potentially manned systems being built just in the United States today. 6. I won't go over them. I only have 10 more minutes to finish with my lecture. Next slide. Now, this is from the Air Force budget, unclassified. It's a 1,200-page document that's so big it looks like a telephone book. This is hidden in one line of a 1,200-page document where they put over $250 million in new money into the Department of Defense for space solar power. I cannot tell you how unusual it is for a line item of $250 million plus to be put in very quietly like this on something as weird as space solar power. And I've tried to find out what they're doing with it, and it is classified out the gazaka. But you can be sure that the U.S. Air Force is taking a very serious interest in space solar power at this point. Next slide. Well, why are all these hundreds of launch vehicles being built? What is the purpose of this great exponential curve that I just talked about? Let me show you in the next 3 slides. Richard Branson wants to put thousands of satellites into space to build an internet in space. Next slide. SpaceX has received FCC, Federal Communications Commission, approval to launch 12,000 satellites, and they've already started launching test satellites, 30 to 60 at a time, on Falcon 9s. SpaceX, econometrically, is not a launch company. It is an internet company. Its entire operational philosophy comes from Silicon Valley. They cannot get the CapEx, the capital, to do what they want to do just from launching. They have to put the internet into geosynchronous orbit. And by the way, this will let over half the Earth have high-speed internet that's very, very cheap. And these people are called customers. Now they're called third world developing nations. Next slide. And Jeff Bezos, having seen the way the wind was blowing, just announced that he wants to put up 3,000 satellites. Well, I think we're up to about 20,000 satellites now. Does everybody understand why there are 100 new launch vehicles being built all over the world? Is there any question? Next slide. And just last week, our smiling buddy there, Elon Musk, made a startling announcement. The new big rocket that he's building, his Starship, the gigantic Starship, as soon as he finishes the first orbital test flight, and it could be as soon as next year, he will begin selling tickets to the public to ride on that rocket. That rocket goes to the moon. That rocket goes to Mars. The last time that Elon did this, when he sold something he hadn't built yet, it was called a Tesla 3 Roadster. And he sold 200,000 of them and used it to finance the construction of the car. So perhaps it's a new way to develop capital. But this is an announcement, June 23rd. Kind of timely for this conference, isn't it? Next slide. Okay, what does this mean statistically? Well, first of all, this is obviously an exponential curve. A few years ago, there was nothing. Now it's $18 billion a year cumulative. Go ahead, next slide. We're at the toe of the curve for the number of venture funds. These are not banks, they're not individuals, they're venture funds that buy into new things like Intel and Google and Microsoft, and now there are 534, and a few years ago there were none, or 2. Next slide. Now how about the number of launch companies by country? Well, there's the United States at 60, but everybody has part of this. The whole world is working on launch vehicles. Eventually, it'll be no more difficult to buy a launch vehicle than it is to buy a ticket on an airplane today. And I can tell you that SpaceX has stated in a government document, which unfortunately I can't bring a copy of to this meeting, that they expect that the cost of a point-to-point ticket on the Earth in the Starship will be roughly the cost of a full economy fare ticket on an airliner. Only you'll get there in a half an hour. Well, if you can get there in a half an hour, who's going to sit for 12 hours on a 787? Not me. Not if it's the same price. Next slide. And rockets, space planes, balloons, so on and so forth. Keep going. Next slide. Nano satellites, small satellites, communication satellites, again, exponentially growing. Next slide. This is the very latest one from Virgin Orbit. You may notice that on the bottom it says, don't release this, it's secret. It's not secret because they showed it to me in a public meeting. Next slide. Now, what does that mean? The most conservative company in the world is United Launch Alliance. It's Lockheed Martin and Boeing. And they say that in a few years, instead of being 300 billion, it'll be 3 trillion. This is horribly conservative. And the reason it's conservative is because it's linear thinking. The reality is exponential. They're thinking linear curves. They are not taking into account that the inventors all over the world are inventing new and better ways to get into space. And by new and better, I don't mean better rockets. I mean things that right now we would think are impossible. Drives that lift you off of the Earth using quantum mechanics. I'm a patent attorney, and I follow the patent literature. There are patents being issued right now for quantum drives that, if they work, will make rockets totally obsolete, just as obsolete as sailing ships were as compared to steamships. They are radically new technologies. They are paradigm shifting, and they're happening right now. Next slide. Well, let's look at a few pretty pictures. This is a Falcon 9. It costs $50 million. Okay, it can launch 23 metric tons. It was built by a 33-year-old kid who's now 45 and divorced 5 times. The point is, everybody said it was impossible. Next slide. His capsule looks pretty good, and it's big, and it's flown many times, and it now is going to fly with people in it. Well, NASA can be a customer, can't they? Sure. So can I, or so can you. Next slide. It's a pretty good-looking capsule. I wouldn't mind flying in that, would you? Next slide. And here's the Boeing capsule and the SpaceX capsule, along with their first crew, which has already been selected. The Boeing capsule costs twice as much as the SpaceX capsule, literally 2 times as much. Next slide. This is the Falcon Heavy. 50 tons to orbit, 40 tons if you don't cross-feed the engines. Next slide. And then the first stage is come back and land. He's done it 3 times. He just launched another Falcon Heavy day before yesterday at night. I suspect most of his launches will be for the government or for communication satellites. You can carry a very big communication satellite with this. This is the U.S. entry into the outer solar system. It's the SLS. Next. This is the Russian entry to heavy lift. It's the Angara 5. Next. This is the Long March 5. It is the heavy launch vehicle for China that has launched already. Next slide. This is the theoretical Long March 9, which is 150 metric tons, 3 times as much lift as a Falcon Heavy. And believe me, the Chinese can build it. They have superb technology. Next slide. The capability is obvious, and it's happening now. Next. Now we get to the Starship, to that thing that's shiny. Next slide. The hopper is already working in Texas, my home state. It's already operating. It's going up and down. The Starship is being built, and the heavy booster. That combination, next slide, that is an actual photograph. It's not a painting or anything. That's the actual vehicle. Next slide. But this vehicle, when it's operational, will go point to point on the Earth to compete with airliners, and it will go to the moon or to Mars if you refuel it in Earth orbit. Next slide. I am out of time now. May I have your indulgence for 2 more minutes that would normally be a question period. We wrote a book on space resources. It will be the subject of a roundtable tomorrow afternoon at 3 o'clock. And if you're interested in space mineral resources, do come to that roundtable, because anybody who comes to that roundtable, I will give them a free copy of the book on space mineral resources. It'll be electronic, but it'll be free. Next slide. This is the problem. The developing world is growing faster than the developed world. Next slide. The population has gone up by 800%, but because of industrialization, the wealth has grown by 48,000%. So next slide. The wealth per person has climbed radically since 1900. Next slide. But the distribution is hideous. Less than 1% of the world's population owns about half of everything. If you go to 10%, you're up to 80% of everything being owned by the top 10%. And the bottom half of the world's population or more only has 3% of the world's wealth. Anybody that thinks that that is a stable situation for this planet, I invite them to test fire a Kalashnikov rifle, because they will have to be using it later in their life. Next slide. I don't have time to talk about this slide, but it basically says that we're at a cusp right now where we have to make a decision about who will be the dominant force in the rest of the world. I'll explain it later if you want. Next slide. We need about 5 planets worth of wealth. Fortunately, we know where it is. Next slide. The wealth is in the asteroid belt, not down on the surface of planets at all. Next slide. And here it is. It's there. We know where it is. We have the technology to get it. We just need to write the legal contracts, and we need to have the capital formation. And the students at this university from all over the world would do it, because the third world will take the risk and the first world will provide the capital. Anybody that thinks that NASA can mine space or that any developed country can do it probably is not correctly evaluating their tolerance for risk. Next slide. Okay, lots of asteroids. We've discovered them recently. Next slide. Next slide. Some of them are worth a lot of money. This one has a lot of platinum in it. Next slide. This one, Europeans, maybe they get this one. Next slide. The resources of our solar system are effectively infinite. The mineral wealth of just 50 asteroids could support a civilization of 10 trillion people. And I can prove that. I can prove that mathematically at twice the U.S. standard of living, at a per capita income of $100,000. The U.S. is at about $50,000 now. Next. We wrote a book about this, the International Academy, and my company published it for the International Academy. Come at 3 o'clock tomorrow, you get a free copy of the book. Next slide. Next slide. Okay, this just tells the conclusion of the study. I'll talk about that tomorrow. Next slide. Always listen to experts. They will tell you what you can't do and why you can't do it. Then go and do it anyway. None of the stuff I told you about before was possible, but it all happened. Next. Next. We've landed on the moon. Next. And gosh, the resources of China support 1.4 billion people. The moon can support more than that. Everything on Earth is on the moon. It's just a little far away. Next. Next. And this is an invention that we're doing with a company in Houston to do remote sampling and mining without landing. Anybody that's interested? The company is in its startup right now. Next. That's what it looks like. Next. Well, at the end of this century, where do you want your grandchildren to be? Do you want them to have just one world, this one? Would you like them to have all of these worlds? It's your choice. Next slide. Next slide. Space mining simplified. Next. Thank you very much. Please send me your questions. I'm sorry I took 36 minutes. Okay. Any questions at all? Yes, sir.
So what do you think about the public...
You've got to come up to me. I cannot hear you. I'm deaf.
So what do you think of public resistance to those, for example, growing internet satellites? So because I read some articles that one observatory, I think in Latin America, did an observation and it was spoiled by a lot of the satellite, like SpaceX satellite. And especially, so that is a problem. So they build an
It's a problem if you're an astronomer.
Yeah, and I mean, what are the responsibilities, especially what you mentioned, the kind of...
Well, first of all, I should say that Elon Musk is going to try to minimize that.
Yeah.
But secondly, we're not going to shut down the lights in Los Angeles because the Palomar Observatory doesn't like having the lights on.
Yeah.
You have to look at the higher good for humanity.
Yeah.
The astronomers have a very different view, of course, because they'd like to not have anything up there.
Yeah.
But we already have thousands of satellites. Next question? Yes.
Thank you. The following question. How can you explain the fact that the United States have the biggest spendings on space, but the China have the biggest number of graduates?
Well, I do
States.
business with China for 10 years. As a matter of fact, my space mineral resources book, the Astronautics Publishing Company of China published the book in Chinese, and we went to a huge party and announced it, hundreds of people, and it is now in academic and technical libraries all over China. The Chinese are very efficient at how they use money. They don't use very much and they get a lot of results. Does that?
I understand.
Maybe we should subcontract.
I know it, but my question is, if you have so many money in the United States for space,
Yeah.
is it possible to have the number of graduates at least at the same level as China?
Well, I would,
You can spend the money for education.
I'd be happy to explain that if you do it privately, commercially, you get 10 times the power. NASA is a government bureaucracy. It spends money very inefficiently and very
Inefficient.
politically.
Inefficient.
Hmm?
Inefficient. Yes.
Inefficiently, yes, they do. For example, only 5% of the NASA budget for 10
For
years,
education.
5% for 10 years, SpaceX and Orbital Sciences, 2 orbital vehicles, 2 capsules. NASA could not possibly have done that with regular government contracting. And private commercial activities will be even more efficient. In fact, they will make money and go into a positive feedback cycle.
Maybe you know that Chinese universities support their students very much. They give a lot of money for students. They send them all over the world.
Well, I was
To
very,
United States, Russia, all over the world.
well, and because of
How many,
that, we have
how
some,
many Chinese students
remember
in
I
the
talked
United
about
States do you
space
know?
policy, Yuri? The space policy in the United States is to not work with China. I think this is not a good idea. I think we should work with them. Why? As you go into space, you're going into a desperately unsettled environment. There are no people, it's harsh, it's vacuum, it's horrible. And you can get killed, and thousands of people will be killed in space. But eventually, millions will live there. When I go into a frontier, I want to have the strongest possible friends with me. I don't want weak friends. I want strong friends. And China and Russia and Europe and Japan, they can all be strong friends together. To ignore China because of domestic foreign policy or national security considerations is short-sighted, in my opinion. Now, I make this point politically, and I get people yell at me in Washington, but it's true. And in 10 years, one of 2 things will happen. Either America and China will be working closely together, just like we do with our former enemy, Russia, today. Or, when our astronauts get back to the moon, they're going to find a Chinese restaurant already open and waiting for them to buy really good dim sum. That's the 2 possibilities. Because
May- may
China
I
can
just-
do it by
No,
itself.
it's my turn, you.
Yeah.
Yeah, my question. The technology is growing exponentially.
The economy is growing
Also
exponentially.
the technology.
Yes,
You
yeah,
see, the
technology.
growing exponential. Legislation is going slower and more complicated, and this this will make legislation always outdated.
Well, you know, how do you like working with Bonnie Dunbar, by the way? I
will
worked
discuss this
with
later.
Texas A&M, which is where he's from. The problem is that law follows reality. It does, if you go in advance of reality with law, like they tried to with the '67 treaty, all you get is a war. All you get is a war. You can't make law in advance of reality. But once the reality is there, there are all sorts of different competing political and economic and social interests. And the law has to take into account all of that. It's kind of like making sausages. If you really like sausage, you really don't want to watch sausage being made. And law is the same way. We like law because without law, we can't go into space. The law and the economics is the problem now, not the, do you agree about that? The technology is there, we can do it? I think most people would agree.
Yeah, but the law that you show, they are really old.
Oh, it's so complicated. Oh, it's awesome.
So this means that the spaces will be the first anarchy
Oh, it won't be.
environment.
What will happen is when people go into space, they will form political groups in space. And those groups will have different interests than on the Earth, and they will make their own laws. And when the people down on the surface say, gee, we don't like your new laws, they will say, you see the asteroid that we have in Earth orbit? It's a big asteroid. We have lots of little rocks we can drop from it. Political reality is such that they will reach a compromise. And you know what a compromise is. It's 2 or more groups reaching a conclusion they both hate. But we will have compromise. There will be, for example, ownership of land. The 1947, I think it is, Universal Declaration of Human Rights in Article 17 specifically says that it is a human right to be able to own property. And that includes real property. So we will own property in space. We will own land. But it's not time for that yet. Just owning the resources now is enough. We have to get up there and do it. And then we'll solve all these problems. Hopefully. I am very encouraged by this new university. I didn't know it existed before Yuri Nikolaevich brought me here. But from 150 countries, people interested in space and taking the knowledge back to their countries. It is the third and fourth developing worlds that have the most to benefit from space development. It will bring them up to the standards of the developed world, not just in information, but in terms of material wealth. There is more wealth up there than down here. I suggest we start working on that problem. Thank you very much.
Are there any lectures for today? One more?
Remember, 3 books tomorrow at 3.